just checking that Penelope's not in the room. Well, I usually don't like to talk about my family, but this time it just fits too perfectly. Penelope is the master of the checklist. And this is something that comes very unnaturally to me. Back in the day when I would travel on my own, you grabbed a backpack, you'd shove in some pairs of pants and socks and whatever, and as long as you had a little bit of cash, credit card maybe, depending upon where it was in my lifespan, and your tickets, passport, you were good. That's not how we travel now. Now, a month and a half before a significant trip, the checklist is out. And the checklist is long. And it has everything that we might need adapted according to whatever the potential trip might be. If we are going abroad, obviously passports right up there at the top, but so are power converters and other sorts of things that might be needed, and it's all very carefully balanced of exactly how many pairs of socks one should need during this time, how many pairs of underwear, whether or not a tie will be necessary or not, because whether or not we're going to a place where it'll be more formal or less formal. But I'll tell you what, in all the years that we have traveled together, which is now going on 23, I believe, 24 actually if you round up, the trips have been a lot nicer, thanks to that checklist. When I traveled on my own, sure, I was a reckless youth, but you know what happens when you're reckless? You make mistakes, and you end up in places trapped between one leg of a trip and the next, sleeping in a van, sleeping by the side of the road. Yes, I've done that from time to time. Running out of money, and so you have to make your last, little dollars last until you can get to the next ATM in the next town that will accept your particular card, and so you're not eating so much for 2 or 3 days. It was a very different experience traveling on my own. It turns out a checklist is a really, really good thing. And I'm very appreciative that Penelope is the keeper of the checklist, because I don't know if I would revert to my old ways if she were not. But it's funny of how transformative having a decent checklist can be. To go back to the beginning of the introduction of the checklist, because you may not know this, but the checklist is not an ancient device. Oh, people have been making lists forever. Go back to the earliest cuneiform tablets, and people have lists of things. But a checklist is relatively modern. For it to become a standardized way of ensuring that something is done right. We're talking 20th century modern. It was, as you might be able to guess, introduced first in medical situations, for doctors, in particular for surgery, in order to make sure that everything was done correctly. And the doctors hated it. They hated it. They considered it profoundly insulting that they would have to stand there and check things off a list from their professional actions. They knew what they were doing. They were trained doctors, for crying out loud. Who were you, some administrator, to come in and hand them a piece of paper while they're about to perform a life-changing surgery and tell them, have you washed your hands? I mean, come on, what kind of doctor do you think I am? Of course I've washed my hands. Did you put on the gloves in this way? Did you make sure these instruments were sterilized? Have you arranged for the anesthesiologist? Have you double-checked on this particular patient's chart if they have any allergies to different forms of anesthesia? Are you sure you're cutting the right leg off? All of those kinds of things sounds insulting. And for professional doctors, especially in the mid-20th century, which were just one step down from God, it was doubly painful. But you can't argue with results. And in fact, the earliest clinical trials of using checklists in medical procedures showed a massive, massive reduction in complication and a huge improvement in the outcomes from those procedures and the quality of life for the patients. And so doctors got used to it, as did airline pilots and people in professions around and around. So now all of us are kind of used to the concept of a checklist. So I'd like to introduce that although checklists in a professional setting are relatively new, they're not new when it comes to Judaism. In fact, this was something that was quite revolutionary to myself personally, and hopefully it will be to you. If you go back into rabbinic writings about the mitzvot, about the commandments, they use a term again and again that I think best is represented with this concept of a checklist. It's called chiyuv. Chiyuv. When we talk about being commanded, the rabbis talk about a chiyuv, which also happens to mean a debt, or you owe something. That you start off each day with a debt. Now, depending upon what that day may be, the debt can alter. Some things never change. We have a debt for tefillah. We have a debt for study. These are things that we are obligated to do on a daily basis. And when we wake up, we are currently in the red. We haven't done them yet because, we only just regained consciousness. And so we have to discharge our debt. We have to fulfill that debt. We have to move ourselves back up into the black. If it happens to be a day like Pesach, then the debt can be a little bit more extreme. We've got matzah to eat. We've got a seder to conduct. We've got maror to eat. And each one of those mitzvot is a separate debt, another line in the ledger of our checklist that it is our obligation to move through and discharge. In fact, the word for exiting your duty is to be yotze, to literally leave, from the same root as Yetziat Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt. You start imprisoned by your debt, and then you leave your state of debt. Now, all of you being nice, modern Americans in a Western society, this probably sounds like crazy talk, because we have been led to believe that we get to choose what we do, that we have rights, we have freedoms, but we have no intrinsic obligations, that we are at liberty to decide for ourselves, I would like to eat matzah because I think that would be nice for keeping the customs of our people. And that's a personal choice. It may be a very consistent personal choice. It may be a personal choice that you are adamant that you will be able to fulfill. But many in the modern world feel that it starts as the personal choice and is fulfilled as a personal choice. That's not how classical Judaism looks at it. You don't get to decide if you are going to do this, if you want to do this. You have a debt. There's a bill. There is a checklist, and it is up to you to check it off. And if you don't, you can't say, well, I didn't want to. That's not how it works. So what do we think? Are we modern Americans, or are we classical Jews from the Middle East? Are we living in a world of freedom, a world of self-expression, of self-realization, of self-discovery? Or are we born in the chains of an archaic tradition binding us to responsibilities and obligations and duties that we've never even had a stake in participating in and deciding? Well, as usual, the answer is yes, both. And of course, Judaism actually itself embraces both of these aspects. But we have to straighten out our thinking a little bit. So first, let's hammer away a little bit at the modern popular conception of being free, of being liberated, of having all choices be our own. Even within the modern world, not even touching on the Jewish obligations, that is pig swill. It doesn't work like that. If you think that you are born free and that all of your decisions come from your innate freedom, then you are absolutely self-contradictory. Because for your freedom to be free, you are going to be then impinging upon everyone else's freedom around you. If you are truly free to do whatever you wish, what happens to those around you who have to deal with the expression of freedom that you are pouring out upon them? If you are free to hit everyone else because you don't like them, well, that's your freedom. You never chose to be bound by the social norm that says violence is a wrong way to solve problems. You believe that you are strong, they are weak, and therefore you should act accordingly. If you think that's wrong, well, who are you to say, I'm free, I should be allowed to make these choices. I have my rights, and my rights are I can do as I wish. Beginning to see the absurdity here. You are obligated from birth to treat other people with dignity, because other people have the right to be treated with dignity, and so do you. This is not negotiable. This is inalienable, as someone once said with perhaps tortuous grammar, but nonetheless, it is true that you are born with certain inalienable rights, as are the people next to you. And those rights create a reciprocal form of obligation, of duty, and responsibility. Pushing back into Judaism, we can see this even more clearly. Judaism looks at the world around us and says, yes, you have rights and freedoms. After all, God took you out of slavery. It's not as though God was a fan of that kind of system. And God gave you the choice of how to live your life, of which path you would walk. He gave you free will. And then he gave you a set of obligations to guide that free will to its most fruitful and productive outcome. And God has encouraged you to think, to feel, to be an expression that is more than a mere mechanical observer of the mitzvot, more than just discharging a checklist. Just as we would hope that a good surgeon or doctor is not approaching their work merely as a mechanical exercise of ticking off the boxes until the patient is finished, but using that as a way to fulfill that spirit of healing. So too in Judaism, the mitzvot are there not merely to be checked off and discharged, but to be used to cultivate and give expression to the feelings that are within us. We can look at the issue of tzedakah, often mistranslated as charity, better translated as the just treatment of those in need. In tzedakah, we have obligations. You own a farm? Great. Those corners, the things that are fallen, the extra sheaves, those belong to the poor. Not you should give them to the poor. Not we strongly encourage that you feel a sense of compassion for those that are in need, and your heart should move you to want to give them to the poor. If you go back and pick them up, you are a thief, because they belong to the poor. You are obligated, whether you like it or not. So too for the tithes, and so too for the other forms of support that are built into the Torah and rabbinic system. They are obligations. They are not recommendations. Now, you're recommended to do it well. You're recommended to do it with kindness and compassion. You're recommended to feel within yourself a sense of camaraderie and of human compassion for all of those around you that are in need. And you're even encouraged to go above and beyond the checklist, the chiyuv, the obligation, and try to help and support those in need beyond the bare minimum that is set down on that list. But if you don't feel like it, you're not off the hook. If you don't feel like helping the poor, you don't like them, they look funny, they smell funny, they act funny, you can't shoo them out of your field. You can't say, no, you I like, you can come and collect, but you I don't like, stay away. You can't do that. You don't have the right, because you have a chiyuv, you have an obligation, whether you like it or not. This mentality helps transform how we approach so much in Judaism. By looking at what God has given us, not as commandments that are some softened form of a suggestion. It's a mitzvah, often said with the intonation as though this were an optional good deed that you're encouraged to do, much like we might talk about the scouting that we talked about last night in Scout Shabbat. It's an obligation. It's a list of things that you are expected to do, and if you don't do them, you're in the wrong for having not done them. Not that you earn brownie points for having done them. If you want brownie points, Judaism does have those aplenty. There are plenty of brownie points once you have done it, but just like a teacher is not going to give you extra credit until you've actually done your primary work, so too Judaism doesn't give you brownie points until you've actually done your basic duties. If you have fulfilled the base mitzvot, you have actually discharged your duties, great. If you want to pray more, absolutely go ahead, and that is going to get you a gold star. If you want to study more, go ahead. You are absolutely going to get a round of applause from the angelic host above you. If you want to give more tzedakah, well, certainly that is going to have a very immediate, tangible benefit for others around you and for your own spiritual development. And so too for every other action of Judaism which has a minimum measure, you can go past that line of the law, and you will find that there is more waiting for you when you do so. But you are not at liberty to desist from at least reaching that line of the law in the first place. We see this explicitly through the construction of the Mishkan. How is the Mishkan described as being constructed here in Parashat Terumah? What is it that God tells Moses to do for all of the people to help build the Mishkan? They should bring as their heart inspires them. Now, understand, of course, again, translations, as I mentioned earlier, are slippery things. Heart in biblical Hebrew does not mean the warm, fuzzy beating thing that's in our chest. Heart means our entire consciousness, what we would now call intellect as well as emotion, which our ancestors did not see a point in dividing into different categories. That was something we have to thank and hate the Greeks for. Instead, you are a whole person, and you should consider with your wholeness what it is you can and would like to give in the building of the Mishkan. And the people did, famously so much that Moses eventually had to tell them to stop, that there was enough, that there was plenty. Don't donate anymore because it can't go for this purpose, and if it was donated for a sanctified purpose, then it's very hard to repurpose for something else, so please, stop. Something else can use your attention. But that doesn't mean that the temple, the Mishkan, was only built because of good intentions. Because we also know from just last week in the maftir that Tilly Rai chanted for her bat mitzvah, that there was an obligation of a half shekel for everyone. That you had to, as part of the census-taking process, bring half a shekel, and that half shekel went towards the temple upkeep, towards the sacrifices. And that was an obligation. You couldn't say, I'm too poor, I can't pay it. You couldn't say, I don't believe in what's going on in the community service. You couldn't say, I haven't been to the Mishkan all year, so why should I support it? Tough. You're part of the community. You're supporting it. Half shekel in the box. This is your chiyuv. This is your obligation. The Mishkan and then later the temple replacement were supported by these two forms of expression. Yes, there was much opportunity for individual spiritual will to either dedicate new sacrifices, dedicate new funds, to provide their skills, their services to the community in the support of the temple and the Mishkan. But there was also a minimum baseline. There was a checklist of what you were expected and obligated to do. And you had to do those things. And that checklist meant that no one could ever fall completely away from the community. By having a minimum standard that we held each other to, by having a checklist for an individual to say, well, have I done the minimum? It forced people to actually do a minimum. And surprise, surprise, just like when you have a checklist in a cockpit or a checklist in an operating room, you end up with better results for everyone involved. When you actually let yourself be kicked in the keister and say, okay, fine, I'm obligated to do this, I'll do it, lo and behold, you actually end up benefiting from doing what's on the checklist. Like I said, just as I now travel much more comfortably and much more successfully than I ever did before Penelope introduced me to the wonders of a travel checklist, so too, spiritually, when you go through the chiyuv, when you have the obligations and you discharge them, when you go through the checklist, it makes a difference. It makes a benefit to yourself. It's almost like it was intended that way. Almost like maybe our ancestors understood the gift that God had given us and how adding this list of clear obligations would allow us to live better lives. So don't resent that we have obligations. Don't bemoan the fact that we've been burdened with Ol Malchut Shamayim, the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. Be grateful that we know what we're supposed to do, that we're not stranded in the cockpit of life, not knowing what all these buttons and dials are for, and not knowing how to take off and travel and land. Don't be perplexed at the world. Look at the list. What should you do? What's expected of you? As the Torah tells us, it is not too difficult to reach that minimum. And when you do, you'll find yourself happier, more satisfied, and with a sense of fulfillment that many at this current time sorely lack. Shabbat Shalom.